If you owe $50,000 and can't pay it back, what happens? Your credit gets destroyed. Your assets get seized. You might lose your home, your car, everything. The system punishes you without mercy. Now answer this. If a government owes $35 trillion and keeps borrowing more every single year, what happens to them? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. In fact, the world lines up to lend them even more money, at lower interest rates, with a smile. How is that possible? What law of mathematics breaks down when we go from personal debt to national debt? Why do the rules that crush you and me simply vanish when a government is holding the bill? If you can answer that question right now, honestly, without guessing, you're in the top 1% of people who actually understand how money works. But if you can't, if something about this feels wrong, but you've never quite figured out why, then everything you're about to hear will change the way you see debt, money, and power forever. Because the answer isn't complicated, it's just hidden, buried under centuries of financial jargon and polite lies. And once you see it, you'll realize the entire global economy is running on a trick so obvious, so audacious, that it only works because no one stops to question it. So here's the real question. Are you ready to see how the trick works? Japan owes more money than any nation in human history. Their debt is 2.5 times larger than their entire economy. By every rule you've ever learned about money, they should have collapsed decades ago. But they haven't. In fact, they keep borrowing more. The United States is $35 trillion in debt. That number grows by roughly $2 trillion every year. If you tried to pay it off at a rate of $1 per second, it would take you over 1,000,000 years. And yet, US Treasury bonds are still considered the safest investment on Earth. Something here doesn't add up. Either we've been lied to about how debt works, or governments are playing a completely different game than the rest of us. This is not a story about economics. It's a story about a magic trick that's been running for over a century. And once you see how it works, you can't unsee it. Let's start with what you already know. If you owe $50,000 on a credit card and you're only making minimum payments, you're in trouble. The interest compounds, the balance grows. Eventually, you default, your credit dies, and you lose everything you couldn't afford in the first place. That's how debt works for normal people. Borrow too much, and the system punishes you. It's simple, it's brutal, and it makes sense. Now apply that same logic to a country. A government borrows billions, then trillions. The debt piles up year after year. At some point, the lenders should panic. They should demand their money back. The government should collapse under the weight of its own promises. Except that's not what happens. Governments just keep borrowing, and the world keeps lending. Why? Because governments aren't people, and the debt they carry isn't like your mortgage or your student loans. It's something else entirely. Something most people never stop to question. Here's the first piece of the trick. Governments don't borrow in foreign currency. They borrow in their own. Think about what that means. When Japan borrows money, it borrows in yen. When the United States borrows, it borrows in dollars. They're not going to a bank in another country and begging for euros or yuan. They're issuing bonds in the very currency they control. And who controls the currency? They do. The central bank, which is essentially an extension of the government, can create more of it whenever it wants. You can't do that. If you owe someone $100,000, you can't just print $100,000 in your basement and hand it over. That's called counterfeiting, and it gets you arrested. But a government can do exactly that, legally, quietly, with the press of a button. This is the first crack in the logic. Debt for a currency-issuing government is not the same as debt for you. Let's go deeper. When a government issues debt, who's buying it? Mostly, it's their own citizens. Pension funds, insurance companies, banks, everyday people who think they're making a safe investment. And in a way, they are. Because the government has made an implicit promise. We will always pay you back. Not because we have to, but because we can. Here's how it works. Let's say the US government needs to borrow $1 trillion. It issues treasury bonds. Investors buy those bonds. The government gets the cash. In return, the investors get a piece of paper that says the government will pay them back in 10 years, plus interest. 10 years pass. The bonds mature. Now the government owes that $1 trillion plus interest. Where does the money come from? Simple. They issue new bonds. They borrow again. They pay off the old debt with new debt. This is called rolling over the debt. And it's not a glitch in the system. It's the system. As long as people keep buying the new bonds, the debt never has to be repaid. It just gets pushed forward. Forever. You're probably thinking, that sounds like a Ponzi scheme. And you'd be right. It has all the characteristics. Old investors get paid with money from new investors. The whole thing only works as long as confidence holds. The moment people stop believing, it collapses. But here's the difference. A Ponzi scheme eventually runs out of suckers. A government doesn't. Because the government controls the money supply, the legal system, and in many cases, the retirement savings of its own population. If you're a pension fund in the United States, where else are you going to put your money? Stocks are volatile. Real estate is illiquid. Gold doesn't pay interest. So you buy treasury bonds. Not because they're a great investment, but because they're the least bad option. And the government knows this. They've designed the system so that you have no choice but to lend to them. Now let's talk about interest rates, because this is where it gets truly strange. Normally, if you're a risky borrower, you pay higher interest. If you're drowning in debt, lenders charge you more to compensate for the risk. That's how markets work. But governments, especially powerful ones, don't follow this rule. Japan's debt is the highest in the world relative to GDP, and yet their interest rates have been near zero for decades, sometimes even negative. Negative interest rates mean you pay the government for the privilege of lending to them. You give them $100 today, and in 10 years they give you back 95. And people still do it. Why? Because the alternative is worse. Holding cash means it loses value to inflation. Investing elsewhere means taking on risk. So investors accept a guaranteed small loss rather than gamble on a bigger one. This is financial absurdity, but it's real, and it's everywhere. Here's the uncomfortable part. The reason this system works is because of inflation. Inflation is the silent tax. It's how governments reduce the real value of their debt without ever defaulting. Let's say the government borrows $1 trillion today. In 30 years, they have to pay it back. But if inflation averages 3% per year, that $1 trillion is worth a lot less in real terms by the time it's repaid. The number on the page stays the same, but the purchasing power has been cut in half. The government borrowed in expensive dollars and paid back in cheap ones. You, the lender, got screwed. But you didn't notice, because the number looked the same. This is the second part of the magic trick. Debt doesn't get repaid, it gets devalued. And if inflation isn't enough, there's another lever. Central banks can just buy the debt themselves. This is called quantitative easing, but don't let the term fool you. It's just a fancy way of saying the government lends money to itself. Here's how it works. The Treasury issues bonds. Private investors don't want to buy them, or there aren't enough buyers. So the Federal Reserve steps in and buys the bonds with newly created money. The Treasury gets cash, the Fed gets bonds, and the money supply expands. Technically, the Fed is independent from the government, but in practice, they work in lockstep. When the government needs to borrow and no one else will lend, the Fed shows up with a blank checkbook. Japan has been doing this for over 2 decades. The Bank of Japan now owns nearly half of all Japanese government bonds. They've essentially monetized the debt, turned it into currency, and the world hasn't ended. The yen hasn't collapsed. Life goes on. This shouldn't be possible, but it is. So why doesn't every government do this? Why doesn't every country just print money and borrow forever? Because not every country can. This trick only works if people trust your currency. The United States can do it because the dollar is the global reserve currency. When other countries trade oil, they use dollars. When they store wealth, They buy dollar-denominated assets. The demand for dollars is structural and global. Japan can do it because they borrow domestically in yen, and their population has no choice but to save in yen. But if you're Argentina or Turkey or Zimbabwe, you don't have that luxury. Your currency isn't trusted, so you have to borrow in someone else's currency, usually dollars. And when your debt comes due, you can't just print your way out, you default. This is the divide. Some governments live in a world where debt is optional. Others live in a world where it's fatal. Let's zoom out for a second. What are the risks here? The first risk is loss of confidence. The whole system runs on belief. Belief that the government will pay. Belief that the currency will hold value. Belief that tomorrow will look like today. If that belief cracks, the entire structure collapses. Bond yields spike. The government can't afford to borrow. They either default or print money so aggressively that the currency becomes worthless. This has happened before. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. When the trick stops working, it stops fast. The second risk is inequality. Inflation and money printing don't affect everyone equally. If you own assets, stocks, real estate, bonds, you're protected. The value of those things rises with inflation. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, inflation just means everything costs more, and your wages don't keep up. The system rewards those who already have wealth and punishes those who don't. It's not a bug, it's a feature. The third risk is that the debt becomes so large, it crowds out everything else. Governments spend more on interest payments than on infrastructure, education, healthcare. The economy becomes a machine designed to service debt rather than serve people. We're not there yet, but we're closer than most people think. Here's the part that makes all of this even stranger. Despite everything we've just talked about, government debt is still seen as safe. When the stock market crashes, investors don't sell their bonds, they buy more. When there's a global crisis, money flows into US treasuries, not out of them. This is the ultimate paradox. The more debt a government takes on, the more essential it becomes to the financial system. Because if that government fails, everything fails. So the system protects itself. Central banks intervene. Other governments step in. The debt gets restructured, postponed, inflated away. Anything to avoid an outright default. Because default would mean admitting the trick doesn't work. And no one in power wants to admit that. Let's bring this back to the present. Right now, the United States is adding roughly $2 trillion to its debt every year. That's not during a war, not during a pandemic, just normal operations. Japan's debt continues to grow. Europe is sliding back into low growth and high borrowing. China's local governments are sitting on mountains of hidden debt that no one wants to talk about. And yet, the world keeps turning. Interest rates are manageable. Inflation is mostly under control. The sky hasn't fallen. So maybe the doomsayers are wrong. Maybe debt really doesn't matter for governments the way it matters for the rest of us. Maybe this can go on forever. Or maybe we're just in the middle of the longest, slowest financial experiment in human history. And we won't know the results until it's too late to change course. Here's what we know for sure. Governments can owe far more than you'd think possible because they control the currency, the interest rates, the central bank, and the legal framework. They can roll over debt indefinitely. They can inflate it away. They can, in extreme cases, have their own central bank buy it. None of this is available to you, or me, or any business. This is a privilege reserved for sovereign currency issuers. And it works, until it doesn't. The question isn't whether governments can keep doing this. Clearly, they can. The question is, what happens when the music stops? When confidence breaks? When inflation spirals? When the global reserve currency is no longer trusted? Because all of this is built on belief, and belief is fragile. There's no satisfying conclusion here, no clean answer. The system is designed to keep running until it can't. And when it can't, The people who designed it will be long gone. What's left is a world where debt has become untethered from reality, where numbers on a screen grow larger every year and no one seems to care, where the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to the ones in charge. You can call it a con, you can call it genius, you can call it the only way to run a modern economy, but you can't say you weren't warned. Because the debt is still growing, the bonds are still being sold, and somewhere, quietly, the printer is still running. But if you can't, if something about this feels wrong, but you've never quite figured out why, then everything you're about to hear will change the way you see debt, money, and power forever. Because the answer isn't complicated, it's just hidden, buried under centuries of financial jargon and polite lies. And once you see it, you'll realize the entire global economy is running on a trick so obvious, so audacious, that it only works because no one stops to question it. So here's the real question. Are you ready to see how the trick works?